In one room, people were holding glasses, making jokes, celebrating journalism. In that same building, Cole Thomas Allen was carrying weapons, calculating timing, mapping exits. Same place, same night. Two completely different realities. One of them trusted the system to work. The other one was there to prove it wouldn't. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't random, and it wasn't sudden. Cole Thomas Allen didn't walk into that event by accident. He traveled across the country by train with intent, arriving in Washington, checking into a hotel a day early, and doing something far more dangerous than panic, he observed. He walked the space. He studied movement. He looked for the moment when security stops being strict and starts being assumed. This is not chaos. This is preparation. And this is not just a story about one man with weapons. This is a story about a system that believed it was in control. Because when Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche was asked about the weapons, the answer sounded almost routine. Purchased within the past couple of years, presumably legally, still under investigation. That's what was said. What wasn't said is just as important. No explanation of how someone carrying that kind of intent could move through layers of security. No clear answer to why the perimeter didn't fully lock down once the event began. No acknowledgement that this wasn't just about stopping a threat, but preventing it from getting close in the first place. And then there are the writings. Because before this happened, Cole Thomas Allen sent messages to his family. Not a manifesto tied to a single ideology, not a clear political alignment, but something more unstable and more dangerous. Frustration. Hopelessness. A belief that the system itself had failed him. He described himself as a friendly federal assassin. That's not just a phrase. That's a mindset. And when you combine that mindset with planning, mobility, and access, you don't get randomness. You get trajectory. Investigators are still looking for a single motive, but the pattern is already visible. Weapons acquired over time, travel planned in advance, arrival early to study the environment, movement inside a space that should have been controlled. These are not isolated facts. These are stacked decisions, and each one moves in the same direction, toward action. Security experts pointed out something critical. This wasn't a complete failure because the president and other protectees were safe. But that definition of success is dangerously narrow. Because if someone can move through the system far enough to test it in real time, then the system didn't stop the threat. It absorbed it. And that's the gap. The gap between protection and prevention. The gap between protocol and reality. The gap that a smart, patient, determined individual can study and exploit. Cole Thomas Allen didn't need the system to collapse. He only needed it to hesitate. And the question now isn't whether the system eventually responded. It's why it had to respond at all. Because by the time you're reacting, someone has already made it further than they ever should have. And once you accept that point, that the system had to react instead of prevent, you're no longer asking how this ended. You're asking how it was allowed to begin. Because Cole Thomas Allen didn't just arrive with weapons. He arrived with time. Time to check in. Time to walk the building. Time to observe where enforcement tightened and where it relaxed. That matters because security is never just about walls and checkpoints. It's about consistency, and consistency is exactly what breaks first. Investigators and analysts pointed to something that should have already been locked down. The moment the protectees were inside, access points should have shifted from monitored to restricted, from flexible to fixed. But that didn't fully happen. And a person who is paying attention, someone trained, educated, methodical, doesn't need a wide-open door. He needs a moment of ambiguity. That's what he found. And here's where the narrative starts to shift from incident to pattern. Because this wasn't just about movement through space. It was about intention over time. The weapons weren't bought the day before. They weren't part of a sudden break. They were acquired over years, legally, quietly, without raising immediate alarms. That's not a spike. That's a buildup. And when analysts looked at his trajectory, they didn't find a single triggering event. They found something more familiar and more uncomfortable. A slow arc. Frustration that didn't resolve. Isolation that didn't break. A mindset that kept tightening until action felt inevitable. We've seen that arc before, and every time the warning signs exist, but they don't align cleanly enough to trigger intervention. That's the problem with systems built to detect clear threats. They struggle with gradual ones. Now layer that with what Cole Thomas Allen wrote, not a manifesto, not a declaration tied to a movement, but messages sent to his family that read less like ideology and more like a final notice. A man anticipating the end, a man imagining the outcome, and possibly a man expecting to die during the act. That changes the equation. Because when someone is no longer planning to escape, deterrence loses power. Barriers lose meaning, and the system is no longer dealing with risk, it's dealing with commitment. So let's move into prosecutorial mode, because the facts are now stacked, and they're not pointing in different directions. They're converging. He traveled across the country with weapons. He arrived early and surveyed the environment. He identified a gap in enforcement timing. He carried out movement inside a controlled space. And he expressed in writing a willingness to die. Those are not separate data points. That is a chain. And every link holds. So when officials describe this as an incident that was contained, that language matters. Because contained doesn't mean prevented. Contained means the system worked after it was already being tested. And that's where the internal contradiction begins. If success is defined by stopping the worst outcome, then the bar is already too low. Because the real standard isn't survival. It's denial of access. It's making sure the scenario never reaches the point where response is needed. And in this case, it did. Which leads to a harder question. Not about what happened in that moment, but about what didn't happen before it. Because if a determined individual can observe, adapt, and move through layers that are supposed to be locked, then the system isn't just reacting late. It's signaling where it's vulnerable. And once that signal exists, it doesn't stay private. It spreads. Not through headlines first, not through official reports, but through pattern recognition. Because once a gap is identified, it doesn't just belong to one person anymore. It becomes a reference point, a proof of concept, and that's the part no one wants to say out loud. Because acknowledging that means admitting this wasn't just a breach. It was a demonstration. Now go back to the environment surrounding that event. Not just the ballroom itself, but everything leading up to it. Pre-event gatherings, networking parties, spaces where high-profile individuals were present, but security wasn't fully enforced. That matters. Because a system is only as strong as its weakest layer, not its strongest one. And according to reporting, there were moments before the main event where someone could have walked in without going through the same level of screening. That's not a minor detail. That's a structural exposure. And when you combine that with what Cole Thomas Allen did, arriving early, walking the space, identifying timing, you start to see something more precise than luck. You see alignment, opportunity meeting preparation. Now consider the physical flow. Hotels are not designed like military bases. They are built for openness, for movement, for accessibility. Guests come and go. Rooms are booked months, sometimes years in advance. And when a high security event is layered into that environment, you don't replace the structure. You adapt around it, which means complexity increases. And complexity is where consistency breaks. That's where a person like Cole Thomas Allen operates, not by overpowering the system, but by navigating it. Now listen carefully to how success was described. Protectees were safe. The president was protected. The immediate threat was stopped. That's the official framing. But here's the contradiction. If someone can exit an elevator with weapons already in hand, already inside the environment, already past multiple layers, then the system didn't stop entry. It stopped escalation. And those are not the same thing. One prevents the event. The other manages it after it begins. That distinction matters more than anyone is willing to admit, because it redefines the risk. This wasn't a case of someone being intercepted at the perimeter. This was someone moving within the interior. And interior access changes everything. It compresses response time. It increases uncertainty. It forces decisions under pressure instead of control. Now shift back to the human side. Because this isn't just about systems and protocols. It's about people. People inside that room who didn't sign up for a security test. Journalists, staff, guests. Individuals who expected an event, not an incident. And in seconds, the environment shifted. From conversation to confusion. From routine to survival instinct. People dropped. People hid. Not because they were told to, but because they've been trained by reality to expect the worst. That's the moral break. Because when a country reaches the point where even a formal dinner requires instinctive survival behavior, something deeper has already shifted. And the system's response, no matter how fast, doesn't undo that moment. It doesn't restore the assumption of safety. It replaces it with calculation. Where is the exit? Where is the cover? What happens if this goes further? That's the cost. Not just the incident, but the normalization of the possibility. And once that possibility becomes real, it doesn't disappear when the room clears. It stays. In the next event, the next gathering, the next time someone walks into a space that used to feel secure, because now there's a new question embedded in the background. Not, is this safe? But how long until it isn't? And that question doesn't stay inside that room. It follows people home. It sits in the back of every public gathering, every crowded space, every event that used to feel routine. Because once a system shows you it can be reached, you don't unsee that. You adjust, you calculate, you hesitate. And that hesitation, that quiet shift in behavior, is the real consequence. Not the headlines, not the official statements, but the erosion of trust in something that was supposed to function without question. Now step back and look at what this actually represents. This is not just about Cole Thomas Allen. This is not just about one event, one building, one night. This is about a system that defines success by outcome instead of prevention. A system that says no one important was harmed and calls that a win. But what about everyone else in that room? What about the fact that a man with weapons got as far as he did? What about the gap that allowed it to happen? Because if your definition of success starts at the moment danger appears, you've already failed the moment before. And here's where the logic tightens. Cole Thomas Allen did not overpower security. He did not outgun the system. He studied it. He moved with it. He waited for it to relax. That's not force. That's adaptation. And systems that can be adapted to, can be repeated. That's the part that should concern you. Not just what happened, but what was proven. Because once a gap is identified, it doesn't close automatically. It gets tested again, refined, shared. Not necessarily by name, not publicly, but through behavior, through imitation, through the same pattern repeating in different forms. That's how risk evolves. Quietly, incrementally, until it looks like a trend instead of an exception. So this isn't a partisan issue. This isn't left versus right. This is about whether the system designed to protect public spaces can still do so before a threat becomes active. Because reacting faster is not the same as preventing earlier. And the difference between those two is measured in seconds. Seconds that determine whether people are safe or whether they're surviving. So the real question isn't whether the system eventually worked. It's whether it worked at the only moment that truly matters. Before the entry, before the movement, before the realization inside that room that something was wrong. Because if the answer to that is no, then what exactly are we trusting? A process that waits for danger to appear, or a system that's supposed to stop it from ever getting close? And if the line between those two keeps getting thinner, at what point does secure become just another word we say until it isn't? If moments like this matter to you, if you believe systems should be tested before they fail, not after, then don't just watch this and move on. Like the video so more people see it. Share it so the conversation doesn't stay quiet. Comment with what you think the real failure was. And subscribe because this doesn't end here.